Welcome to Module 4, the final module in the Safety and Violence Prevention Project. For the modules on violence against children, child abuse, and human trafficking, we have two special guests from the greater Cincinnati community who will be offering their expertise on this topic. Special Agent Pamela Matson with the Cincinnati Division of the FBI, who has been an agent for 25 years and investigating human trafficking cases in the greater Cincinnati for the past 7 years. Erin Meyer, Anti-Human Trafficking Coordinator for the Salvation Army. She has been in that position for 2 years. Before that, she was involved in the Polaris Project in Washington, D.C., which operates the National Human Trafficking Hotline. The purpose for today's training is to help you identify incidences of violence against children and make appropriate referrals in such cases. Specifically, we will discuss how to recognize and intervene in incidences of child abuse and human trafficking behaviors. Remember that you are not being asked to provide therapeutic interventions for the students involved. We hope you will be able to let the students know that you notice them, that you care, and that you will be able to refer the students involved to professionals who are trained to provide interventions.
I'm Erin Meyer, the Anti-Human Trafficking Program Coordinator with the Salvation Army, and I'm here to talk a little bit about human trafficking and child abuse here in Cincinnati. We'll cover topics that relate to violence against children, both human trafficking and child abuse. These topics are similar in certain ways. Each happen frequently in this community and represent serious barriers to learning. Each are underreported, and whether a student is a target of violence by adults or other students, it can have a great impact on their learning. So here today, we're going to learn about what those impacts are and how we can respond to it. For some, being a target of violence can result in mental health issues, such as depression, substance abuse, suicide, and other elements that have been covered in Modules 2 and 3. Other victims who are targets of abuse can become aggressive, abusive, and violent towards others. School professionals can interrupt this destructive cycle through proactive referrals. So it's important here to recognize, reach out, and refer before problems escalate into life-altering levels such as suicide, violent attacks, abduction, and murder. Noticing behavior that isolates the target is critically important for school professionals. Victims of violence are conditioned to believe that no one can help or that reporting will result in harm to themselves or others. They can feel that it is their fault, and we'll talk more about what the emotional detriments are in a moment. Child abuse is an extremely serious topic, one that many educators will address at some point throughout their career, with 5 to 25% of students experiencing some type of abuse or neglect each year. Teachers are often the de facto reporters of child abuse suspicions, and school professionals are at times in a position to identify and report suspicious abuse. There are barriers to reporting, however. School personnel may struggle with what constitutes abuse, with personal reactions to learning of a young child's abuse, unclear guidelines for reporting the alleged abuse, and fear regarding the outcome of reporting, particularly as it relates to reactions of parents and the community. Those barriers pose a threat to today's youth, many of whom are at risk for neglect and abuse. Child abuse manifests in various behaviors affecting a child, including neglect, verbal and emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. Reporting child abuse is something that occurs throughout the country and falls oftentimes on school professionals. Nearly 3.3 million reports were made to Child Protective Services in 2010 in the United States, with 1/5 of those substantiated as child abuse or neglect. Ohio is ranked 30th in the rate of child maltreatment in the United States, with 12.4 children out of 1,000 as subjects of abuse. Again, child abuse is related to many other mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders. And children who are abused or neglected are more likely to become arrested, commit violent crimes, and be arrested as adults. Therefore, it's imperative that school professionals recognize the signs and report. The types of abuse that we see are neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and psychological maltreatment. Most of you have already received training on how to recognize these and these types of abuse, so we'll just briefly talk on those. In a study conducted by the Department of Education in 1994, it was found that the majority of cases that were reported were those of neglect at 78.3%, neglect being categorized as the neglect of physical, emotional, or educational needs of a student. Reports of physical abuse were 17.6%. Physical abuse can include slapping, kicking, and hitting that goes beyond normal accepted elements of discipline. Sexual abuse was at 9.2%. And again, sexual abuse is involving abusers' sexual gratification gained as a result of contact. So it can be a broader definition than one might initially believe or think. Psychological maltreatment was at 8.1%. And again, psychological maltreatment is generally can include calling the child names or generally disparaging the child. Approximately 5 children die each year in the United States due to child maltreatment, and children are the most vulnerable to sexual abuse between the ages of 8 and 12, with the average age for first abuse at 9.9 years for boys and 9.6 years for girls. As mentioned, there are several types of child abuse, but the core element that ties them together is the emotional effect on the child. Children need predictability, structure, clear boundaries, and the knowledge that their parents and other caring adults are looking out for their safety. Abused children cannot predict how their parents or other caring adults will act. Their world is an unpredictable, frightening place with no rules. Whether the abuse is a slap, a harsh comment, stony silence, or not knowing if there will be dinner on the table, the end result is a child that feels unsafe, uncared for, and alone. The types of child abuse are as follows: sexual abuse, which involves the abuser's sexual gratification gained as a result of contact. It can be in the form of a sex act, touching, or other abuse. Emotional child abuse. When we think about emotional child abuse, we think about the age-old phrase, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." Contrary to this old saying, emotional abuse can severely damage a child's mental health or social development, leaving lifelong psychological scars. Examples of emotional child abuse may include belittling, shaming, and humiliating a child, name-calling, and negative comparisons to others, telling a child she is no good, worthless, bad, or a mistake, frequent yelling, threatening, or bullying, or ignoring or rejecting a child as punishment, giving him or her the silent treatment, limited physical contact with the child, no hugs, kisses, or other signs of affection, and or exposing the child to violence or the abuse of others, whether it be the abuse of a parent, a sibling, or even a pet. Child neglect is a very common type of child abuse. It's the pattern of failing to provide for a child's basic needs. These needs can range from adequate food, clothing, hygiene, or supervision. It's not always easy to spot. Sometimes the parent may become physically or mentally unable to care for their child, such as with a serious injury, untreated depression or anxiety. Other times, alcohol or drug abuse may seriously impair the judgment and the ability to keep a child safe. Older children may not show outward signs of neglect, becoming used to presenting a competent face to the outside world, and even taking on the role of the parent. But at the end of the day, neglected children are not getting their physical and emotional needs met. Physical abuse involves the physical harm or injury to a child. It may be the result of a deliberate attempt to hurt the child, but not always. It can also result from severe discipline, such as using a belt on a child or physical punishment that is inappropriate to the child's age or physical condition. Many physically abusive parents claim that their abuse is simply in the form of punishment or discipline for a child. It can be difficult sometimes to understand the difference between physical abuse and discipline. Some of the main components that we need to consider when determining whether or not a situation is that of physical abuse or discipline, again relates back to whether or not the situation is unpredictable or is resulting in demonstrating a lack of caring from the parent. One element is unpredictability. The child never knows what is going to set the parent off. There are no clear boundaries or rules. The child is constantly walking on eggshells, never sure which behavior will trigger a physical assault. Lashing out in anger, so not in response to a missed curfew or something else, but lashing out in anger. Physically abusive parents act out of anger and the desire to assert control, not the motivation to lovingly teach the child. The angrier the parent, the more intense the abuse. And using fear to control behavior also moves onto the line of physical abuse versus discipline. Parents who are physically abusive may believe that their children need to fear them in order to behave, so they use physical abuse to keep their child in line. However, what children are really learning is how to avoid being hit, not how to behave or grow as individuals. In response to these statistics and other elements, Congress passed the Child Abuse Treatment Act in 1974, which is a law that mandates school personnel and other professionals report child abuse. Since that time, all state legislators have incorporated laws requiring the reporting of abuse and neglect, and child abuse laws state that these reports do not require absolute proof of abuse. Rather, they must reflect reasonable cause for suspicion or believing the abuse has occurred. Therefore, it's not imperative that you have facts stating that the abuse definitely occurred. It is not your responsibility to determine the definitiveness of these abuse acts. But if you believe abuse is occurring, it is your responsibility to report that abuse is occurring. The sources of reports can vary. As mentioned, it's imperative that educational personnel be informed as to what abuse is and how to report it. Educational personnel are the most prevalent reporters. In federal fiscal year 2010, 3/5 as 58.6% of all reports of alleged child abuse or neglect were made by professionals. The most common report source was educational personnel at 16.4%. Legal and law enforcement personnel followed closely behind at 16.7%. And social services staff was at 11.5%. Professionals have submitted more than 1/2 of all reports for the past 5 years, and that percentage has increased slightly each year since 2006, according to a report done by the Department of Health and Human Services in 2010. The 4th National Incidence Study of Child Abuse and Neglect showed that public schools report more cases of child abuse and neglect than any other institution, again, demonstrating the imperative nature for school professionals understanding child abuse and human trafficking and reporting it. These findings reflect the central role each school professional plays in identifying children who are abused and neglected. Educators play a unique role because they have access to children and expertise in child development. Providing educators with the tool to identify, reach out, and refer in cases of abuse and neglect can help prevent or minimize the damaging effects of these violent behaviors. There are many effects as a result of child abuse, neglect, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. Survivors of child abuse often go on to develop other emotional difficulties. Many survivors tend to blame themselves for the abuse or blame others for not seeing or stopping the abuse. Varying symptoms can be experienced as a result, but the impact is that on learning. It makes it difficult to learn as a result of these abuses, and thus it's important for school professionals to be aware. Child sex abuse is a type of abuse that is much more difficult to identify and is often very difficult for us to talk about. Child sexual abuse occurs more often than we may imagine. It's estimated that up to 20% of female children, up to 12% of male children are sexually abused before 18. These statistics on child abuse are very difficult to interpret due to the extremely low reporting rates of sexual abuse. We do know, however, that girls are more likely to be sexually abused than boys, and that the vast majority of sexual abuse occurs between people who know and often trust one another. For children, this is usually a family member or a close friend. Another factor that can complicate the accuracy of identification of abuse is the student's developmental level. Talking about child abuse can be difficult for different students of different ages. Elementary school students in particular may have difficulty verbalizing what has happened and naming the person who is abusing them. This inability to communicate abuse can occur despite clear indications that abuse is taking place, often due to the intense and complex relationship that the child likely has with the perpetrator. An additional reason that child sex abuse is often unaddressed is that children have difficulty talking about being sexually abused and often feel embarrassed, guilty, or responsible for the abuse. Unfortunately, sometimes adults can reinforce these feelings in children. Research indicates that educators have more difficulty believing a victim of sexual abuse when there is no apparent physical evidence and when the victim is female and over the age of 10. Because educators see children often and have relationships with them, their interactions can positively affect whether or not a child discloses abuse. Building rapport with a child can really break down the barriers of reporting and encourage a student to share. Despite reports that many teachers feel burdened by student mental health and emotional needs, teachers are able to identify students who are likely to benefit from mental health services. In addition to building rapport and connecting with the student so that he or she feels comfortable reporting the situation, there are other warning signs outside of the divulgence of a story. You might notice indicators such as anxiety, depressed mood, eating disorders, and substance abuse among students who have been abused. As you can see, child abuse is highly related to other topics that were discussed in this curriculum. Survivors of sexual violence may display an awareness of sexuality that is not appropriate for their age and sexualized behavior that are not developmentally or socially appropriate. In addition, you may notice hypervigilance, a lack of trust, and for neglect, someone may appear unkempt or hungry. These children are also vulnerable to further exploitation, including being forced into commercial sex act. Studies show that up to 95% of sex trafficking victims were abused prior to entering into their situation. That might have been child abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, or incest. According to federal law, any minor involved in such commercial sexual exploitation is a victim of sex trafficking and thus deserves access to resources. When determining if child abuse is taking place, it's important to remember some key elements when interviewing a child. Avoid shaming or blaming. Again, very often, particularly as it relates to sexual abuse and sex trafficking, many child abuse victims believe it is their fault, and that reinforcing that during an interview will not lead to the victim feeling comfortable sharing information with you. Don't interrogate that individual. Again, they need to feel as if they are building a relationship with someone who they can trust to share the information. If they are a survivor of abuse, they're constantly living in fear that they may be harmed, hurt, or consistently trying to determine what is the best action to get them out of an abusive or neglectful situation. If you interrogate this individual, they may become flustered. They may feel that they need to answer questions in a certain way so that you believe them, so that you will let them get the things that they want. And interrogating an individual may confuse and fluster them. You need to also meet them where they are, recognizing that particularly with younger victims, it may be very difficult for them to share their story, or older victims as well. If you continue to push to get information out, it may break down the rapport that's being built, and it may make it more difficult for that individual to feel comfortable reporting in the future. So remember, they control the level of information that they share. You can make a report based on the information you gather and determine by yourself how you want to report or what the next steps will be. But it's important to not re-traumatize the victim by making them feel that they need to share more information than they're comfortable sharing. In addition to forcing that may break down the rapport. You need to reassure that individual that they did nothing wrong. Again, a lot of victims of trauma self-blame. It's important that we as professionals reinforce that that's not the case. Avoid conditional questioning. Many survivors of abuse, again, are consistently relying on the actions of others to determine what the next steps are. Offering ice cream in lieu of a completed statement or extra recess time will not necessarily result in additional truthful information being gained, and it can be detrimental to rapport building in that the questioner then becomes aligned with the abuser because they're treating that victim in the same type of conditional way. If you don't follow what I say, you don't get what you want. So it's very important to avoid that type of conditional questioning and just, again, keep pace and use open-ended questions to engage the individual and get what information you can. Finally, safety comes first. You are the reporter, you are the adult, the professional. It is your authority to determine whether or not to report and how to move forward. If you feel that you or the victim are going to be unsafe by intervening, it's important that you don't do that. If you ever believe that it's your role to intervene, it's important to consult with your school professionals prior to that to determine if that truly is the next best step. Intervening can put you and others at risk, so it's important to leave it to the professionals if that's the best next step. In terms of what to look for, now that you've had the opportunity to talk to this individual and build some rapport, there are various indicators for different types of abuse. Some of the warning signs for emotional abuse can be excessive withdrawal, fear or anxiety about doing something wrong, extremes in behavior, either extremely compliant or extremely demanding, extremely passive or extremely aggressive. Again, some of that can be influenced by the demeanor of the questioner as well, so it's important to, again, remember to maintain that calm, collective questioning. Doesn't seem to be attached to the parent or caregiver, acts either inappropriately grown up by taking care of others or inappropriately infantile. Some warning signs of physical abuse in children can be frequent injuries and unexplained bruises, welts, or cuts. The individual is hypervigilant or always watchful or on alert, as if waiting for something bad to happen. Injuries may appear to have a pattern such as marks from a hand or belt. The individual may shy away from touch, flinch at sudden movements, or seem afraid to go home. They may wear inappropriate clothing in the season to cover up injuries, such as long-sleeve shirts on hot days. Warning signs of neglect in children can include that the clothes on the child are ill-fitting, filthy, or inappropriate for the weather. Hygiene may not be consistently good. The individual may be unbathed or unkempt. Untreated illness or physical injuries. The individual may be frequently unsupervised or left alone, or allowed to play in unsafe situations and environments, or they may be frequently late or missing from school. In terms of indicators for human trafficking survivors, some of these that we've mentioned for child abuse can be seen as well, in addition to if you're in the position of a school nurse or seeing someone's medical records, they may have increased presence of STIs or other sexual relationships with adults or evidence of sexual activity with others or multiple partners. And there may be other evidence of, similar to the emotional abuse, the increased startle reflex, hypervigilance, and other dissociations with friends, change in mood or behavior as evidence, as an indicator for emotional abuse or sexual abuse or physical abuse as well. Now that you have a better understanding of what child abuse and human trafficking are, it's important to report. Educators are mandatory reporters of child abuse. According to the Ohio Revised Code, you must report knowledge or suspicion of child abuse to your local Child Protective Services agency. Such reports, which can be made anonymously, should be made following your school district's policies and procedures. A March 2007 amendment to the Ohio Revised Code states that an educator's failure to report suspicion of child abuse is a first-degree misdemeanor, punishable by up to 6 months in prison and a $1,000 fine. Each school district may have specific policies and procedures that you need to follow as a school professional. Please consult your school's administration to determine what is the most appropriate next steps. If you suspect child abuse, it can be reported to Child Protective Services at 241-KIDS. Reports are taken 24 hours a day. Reports must also be made with your school administration. And again, all other policies and procedures as they relate to your school should be followed. When an actual report is made to Child Protective Services, you should call the agency and make as complete a report as possible. You should document the conversation you had with the child and ensure that the intake coordinator got all of your information. In addition to working with students who are presently targeted by violence, you may also work with students who have previously been hurt and abused. So once the report is made, that doesn't mean that it ends. As a school professional, you can connect with the intervention assistance teams at your school and help get that child the support that he or she needs. Through those intervention assistance teams. There are school psychologists, school counselors, social workers, and other administrators and professionals that may be able to assist in responding to the mental health and other emotional needs that that child might have. It's important to reach out to your school professionals and school administration to connect with those intervention assistance teams and get that support. There are additional resources for recognizing the signs, determining how to move forward in a report, and how to abide by the Ohio Revised Code. You can find additional information through the Ohio Children's Trust Fund, which is the Ohio chapter of Prevent Child Abuse America. Their website contains many resources on what to do if you suspect child abuse or neglect, and how to work with children and families to prevent abuse from occurring. Each county children's services agency also has many resources on reporting and preventing child abuse and neglect. According to the 4th National Incident Study of Child Abuse and Neglect, better working relationships should be formed between CPS agencies and schools. As a result, facilitators are encouraged to reach out to their local CPS agency, which again can be contacted through 241 Kids.
Aaron, I want to thank you as far as for the wealth of information regarding as far as abuse, and especially what we as educators can do as far as within Cincinnati Public School with this very serious concern. I do have some follow-up questions.
Okay.
And my first is, being a psychologist and mental health specialist, I'm always curious about the mental health concerns that may be associated as far as with abuse, also as far as human trafficking.
Well, when we see victims of abuse, there is a lot of different mental health manifestations that we can see there, or results that we have, mental health elements that are results of that type of abuse. So it can be depression, anxiety, insomnia sometimes, which is more of a physical manifestation of some of those mental health stressors. But also it's important to remember that victims can sometimes identify with the victim mentality or the victimizer. So that emotional mental health manifestation can result in disorders that are both on the aggressive side and on the internalization side, where victims are becoming more withdrawn and internalizing the pain. So when we're talking about mental health and it's the way it manifests itself, it can look different in different individuals. Post-traumatic stress disorder is also a huge factor when we're talking about survivors of abuse. Recognizing that, again, there's this consistent abuse, this consistent fear for safety and security, and so it creates post-traumatic stress disorder for these individuals.
Okay. We're always concerned about the services as far as here in Cincinnati. So what are some of the specific services, legal services, social services, health, mental health services for children who have been abused?
Well, again, you all have resources here in your school with the intervention assistance teams, and you can connect with them to get more localized, specific referrals, but also there's more generalized referrals out there through Jobs and Family Services, the Child Welfare Program. They offer a lot of different supportive services, as do the Child Advocacy Centers. We have one here right at the Mayerson Center at the Children's Hospital. So not only can they provide medical support, but they also have advocates and social workers there who can provide other types of referrals and supports, in addition to Hope for Children and Families and some of the Family and Children First councils in the counties in the greater Cincinnati area that can help connect with resources in the community.
Okay. As a teacher, as an educator, I'm concerned that reporting as far as abuse might actually affect my relationship as far as with the student, parents, and or guardians.
That's certainly something that can occur, and again, working with the school administrative staff and legal professionals there can be a great support for the educator to determine, what are the best steps, how is the best way to alleviate any kind of issues that may come up, mediation techniques and support there. But it's important to remember that as mandatory reporters, reporting child abuse is the first and foremost need in a situation like that. Obviously, you want to be considerate of other people's feelings and emotions, but that can be secondary to the safety and security of that child. So it's important to take it into consideration. Again, consult with your school administrators or legal team if you have any concerns or if any legal situation arises, but the safety and security of that child is first and foremost, so that's got to come first.
Okay. Aaron, again, I want to thank you as far as responding as far as to my particular questions. And as I said, I hope that this information will be very helpful, not only to our, quote, educational staff, but all employees of Cincinnati Public.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Pam Matson. I'm a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Cincinnati. In my daily work, I investigate cases of human trafficking. I feel that school staff members are uniquely positioned to identify victims of human trafficking. For that reason, I'm very glad to be here to be talking about human trafficking. Human trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of labor or a commercial sex act, in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, and the person forced to perform such an act is under the age of 18 years. All 50 states have reported cases of human trafficking. 200,000 people have been trafficked in the United States, with an estimated 100,000 children involved in sex trafficking. In Ohio, 50 cases have been reported in the past 9 years, with 1,078 U.S.-born Ohio youth sex trafficked in 2011. The work or services may include anything from bonded or forced labor to commercialized sexual exploitation. Studies suggest that up to 90% of runaway youth become involved in the commercial sex industry. There are currently 700 to 800 active missing children cases in Ohio, and about 90% are runaways. On average, there are 19,000 to 20,000 missing children reports per year in Ohio, with about 90% as runaways. That is according to the Missing Persons Unit of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. In the business of human trafficking, there is the seller, the buyer, and the product, or the victim. The sellers or trafficker are men and women from all walks of life. The seller could be an individual or an organized crime syndicate that has predatory romantic involvement with the victim. The seller offers seemingly legitimate work opportunities for food, housing, and clothes, and drugs in exchange for sex. The buyers or Johns also come from all walks of life. The buyers feel as if they own the victim they purchase and subject them to painful, abusive fantasies. The buyers and sellers drive the sex trade and profit for the demand for commercial sex. Components of the business: the victim. The victim has typically run away or is homeless, or is vulnerable in other ways. Most minor victims willingly go with their trafficker or seller. Many minor victims do not think they are a victim and learn not to trust social services, law enforcement, and other agencies. Online solicitation is increasing with the use of social media and commercial sex websites. Components of the business: the victim. The average age that a person first enters into commercial sex industry is 12 to 14. Victims of human trafficking are often not permitted to leave the trafficking organization. They are not usually physically restrained. Rather, they are psychologically coerced into believing that they cannot leave the situation. Presence of pre-existing adult prostitution markets in communities where large numbers of street youth are concentrated. There are large numbers of unattached and transient males. There are often large memberships in gangs, runaways, and homeless youth. The victims are recruited by organized crime groups in some cases. The victim possesses large amounts of cash and perhaps hotel room keys. The victim has unexplained school absences and is unable to attend school regularly. The victim looks like a minor but often claims to be an adult. And there are often branding or tattoos on the victim. The victim lies about his or her age and or possesses false identification. The victim tells life stories with inconsistencies. And lastly, another factor is the victim has little knowledge of the community where he or she is. Other factors associated with human trafficking of minors. The minor is involved with abusive or controlling partner or older boyfriend. she or he has signs of physical abuse or injury. She or he appears to be engaged in scripted communication or has been rehearsed by someone else. He or she has a fearful or anxious demeanor. He or she appears hungry and or malnourished very often. The victim wears clothing that is not appropriate based on the age or season or weather. The victim appears addicted to drugs. Another factor is that the victim shows a shift in behavior, dress, or belongings, such as sudden possession of expensive items. Other factors associated with human trafficking of minors. The victim does not have control over his or her own schedule, which often does not leave time for school. The victim does not have control over his or her forms of identification. The victim talks about sexual activities that exceed age norm groups. And the victim is involved with a boyfriend who is 10 years or more older than the victim.
Solutions to respond to human trafficking in the greater Cincinnati area are as follows. Increased public education awareness, which you all are taking part in today by participating in this module. Additionally, other supplemental trainings, presentations, and support in your classrooms can be coordinated through the Anti-Human Trafficking Coalition and Slavery Cincinnati. Information can be found on their website to obtain additional information. Outside of additional training about the issue as a whole, increased awareness as it relates to demand reduction and healthy relationships can also be important to reducing human trafficking in the greater Cincinnati area. These are trainings and presentations that are geared towards the students and helping them to understand what a healthy relationship is. Also dispelling the myths surrounding pornography and prostitution. Again, these resources can also be coordinated through the coalition by contacting them through their website. Again, In Slavery Cincinnati is the coalition. Finally, reporting human trafficking is the most direct route you can take towards preventing the continued abuse of a child. To report a human trafficking situation, you can call the local hotline at 513-800-1863. This hotline can connect you with local law enforcement and local resources, including case managers and victim advocates to respond with crisis intervention and other resources and support for individuals in need. They can also connect you and help guide you towards next steps if additional reports need to be made, such as those towards 2-for-1 kids or to the National Human Trafficking Hotline if the abuse is occurring outside of the greater Cincinnati area. When in doubt, you can always report to the National Human Trafficking Resource Hotline as they report their information, their local tips to the local hotline. The National Human Trafficking Resource Center number is 1-888-373-7888. Both of these hotlines can be accessed 24 hours a day, are confidential, and there's access to teleinterpreters should the victim or others need to connect in a different language. It's important, however, when determining next steps for reporting, to consult your school administrator to make sure that you are following all necessary policies and procedures as they relate to reporting human trafficking at your school. For additional resources, you can always connect with the Ohio Department of Education's website for more information on human trafficking. Also, additional resources will be available. When in doubt, you can always contact the hotline. Regardless of the amount of information that you may have, you can get additional information, resources, and support in terms of determining next steps and how to respond to the needs of this individual. If you believe someone is in an immediate physical danger, please contact 911. But additionally, contact the hotline, again, so they can discuss next steps in terms of reporting and coordinating resources.
I want to thank you, Pamela, and also Aaron, for providing a wealth of information regarding the topics as far as of child abuse, but also importantly as far as human trafficking. And I do have some follow-up questions, especially regarding human trafficking. First, is human trafficking really happening here in Cincinnati, and how prevalent is it?
Unfortunately, human trafficking is happening here in the Cincinnati area. We don't want you to believe that it is happening on a huge scale. However, I have investigated numerous cases of human trafficking. The instance of human trafficking of children is fortunately far less prevalent than that of adults, particularly in sex trafficking. But please know that there have been cases in Cincinnati of sex trafficking of children.
And when we think about the prevalence of trafficking, it's also important to note that a lot of it is, just like with other forms of child abuse, it's an often underreported crime. And so we have studies out there that give us an understanding of what trafficking can look like, and we have our anecdotal information based on investigations, number of clients that we see, number of victims identified. But we do also know that there's still a lot we don't know about the prevalence in the community because it's just so frequently underreported or misdiagnosed, if you will, or misrepresented in a different type of abuse or a different type of crime. And so there's still just a lot we don't know about its prevalence, but we have seen an exponential increase in the 2 years that we've been in operation. Each quarter, the number of individuals that we engage with increases. And so we don't believe that's because there's a huge jump all of a sudden in the number of people who are being victimized, but more that there's a greater understanding of the issue in the community, and so more people are reporting, and so we're having the opportunity to identify more victims.
As an educator, what do I do if I think that one of my students is involved in human trafficking?
Well, first of all, you should follow your school protocols as far as reporting. And secondly, the next thing you do is have your facts together so that you can talk to someone and give them the facts you know. Perhaps you might go back and think about the indicators that we discussed in the presentation, signs that the child may possibly be a victim of trafficking, and then report those facts to the authorities. And by authorities, I don't mean the FBI, because typically I don't recommend that you contact the FBI directly. You probably should contact either the local human trafficking hotline or the national human trafficking hotline. And we've provided the numbers to both of those previously.
Reporting to those hotlines, you can not only share information, as Pam mentioned, so that law enforcement or other agencies can be contacted to respond, including Child Protective Services if appropriate, but also you can get guidance as to what are the next steps. If you're not sure if it's a human trafficking case, or you're not sure if it merits a report, somebody on the other end of either the local or the national hotline can talk with you about what options there are, what next steps there might be, and help you to further evaluate, again, in consultation with your school administrator, what the next steps might be.
What's the difference between people engaging in commercial sex on the street as compared to human trafficking?
Well, what a lot of people don't know is people who engage in street prostitution may be victims of human trafficking. Whenever there is a pimp involved, if that pimp is coercing the individual to commit commercial sex acts, then that is in fact human trafficking. So therein lies the difference. From a law enforcement standpoint, if an individual is willingly, i.e. of the age of legal consent to do street prostitution, if there are no compulsion factors, that probably is not human trafficking. But one thing you should recognize is that most people who are involved in commercial sex trafficking are not, in fact, doing it willingly.
And Pam brought up an important note. Law enforcement have more strict regulations in terms of evaluating or assessing whether or not a case is trafficking or not. Local resources such as the anti-human trafficking program at the Salvation Army and that serves the greater Cincinnati area we have the opportunity to engage with individuals whether or not they meet that strict assessment. We can still connect with them and help connect them with other community resources that we work with, that are part of our coalition, that are part of our collaborative, to help get that individual access to resources. And it may be that upon first glance, it doesn't seem that the person is under control, but with further engagement with service providers and with others with whom they feel they can build rapport, that individual may feel more and more comfortable sharing more and more details about their story, and it may turn out that in fact they are being coerced or there is compulsion that previously they weren't comfortable reporting. So it really is about this development of a culture of fear, which includes the traffickers and controllers making that individual feel that they can't report and they can't share information or something bad might happen. So it takes time sometimes for the full truth to come out.
I think it's important to note that if in law enforcement we determine that a case is not human trafficking, if in fact the service providers can provide or can encourage the victim to provide additional details, law enforcement would be happy to relook at the situation. So where we may not think that there's trafficking initially, it may turn out to look more like trafficking as the more the victim is known and gets to talk to authorities.
In the greater Cincinnati area, what resources are available to trafficking survivors?
Well, we have the Anti-Human Trafficking Program, which is kind of the clearinghouse for trafficking cases in the greater Cincinnati area. We have a case management program and a 24-hour hotline. This allows survivors of trafficking in the area to have access to support and referrals and other resources throughout the day at any point in time, 24 hours a day. It also serves as an opportunity to kind of field and connect individuals with different resources throughout the community. So particularly as it relates to minors, we very frequently work with Jobs and Family Services, other elements of child welfare, and the child advocacy centers, other resources throughout the community to help connect those individuals to the resources that they need, in addition to obviously counseling. There's a lot of different needs that survivors have, and so we work with a variety of different organizations throughout the community to help respond to those needs, in addition to working with parents or other guardians to develop a service plan. When we're talking about minors, when we're talking about adults, we work directly with that adult to develop a service plan so that they can realize the dreams that they have, and again, the end goal is self-sufficiency and empowerment for that individual. So there's a lot of different resources out there. The 24-hour hotline can be that first step to connect with different resources. And again, we connect with a variety of different agencies throughout the community to respond to needs, whether that's counseling, substance abuse treatment, and just generally housing, whatever it might be, the variety of different needs that are out there.
I think one of the things that we should talk about is that the FBI also has a victim specialist. Mm-hmm. Our victim specialist helps guide an individual through the legal process if a case is actually charged and goes through the court system. Helps the individual have a little better understanding of what's going on as far as the process, the whole legal process. Our victim specialist works very closely with Aaron, and I work very closely with Aaron because it's important for me to have a stable victim who is able to provide testimony if it's going to be needed. So Aaron does a lot to help us with that. I also want to note that on a regular basis, the FBI is not the only agency involved in investigating human trafficking here in the Cincinnati area. The Cincinnati Police Department is involved, as are many other local law enforcement agencies, and they all coordinate with Aaron for services for the victims.
As an educator, what can I do if I believe one of my particular students have been involved as far as with human trafficking?
Well, we do public education and awareness throughout the schools, including efforts such as these to help inform the first responders in the education field and for what are the identifiers, what are the red flags, and what are the next steps. When it comes to longer term care, obviously we work with Jobs and Family Services, their guardian ad litems, school counselors, other elements to make sure that as a whole, the resources are there and the needs are being met. So particularly as it relates to minors, we often see ourselves as helping to provide those wraparound services, so kind of filling in the gaps where necessary. As you know, Salvation Army has thrift stores, so whether it means that we're helping to provide supplemental food in the form of access to our food pantry for the family, if food stamps aren't covering the needs there, or as mentioned, accessing the Salvation Army store for helping to provide clothing through the voucher system, or again, when it's responding to counseling, maybe a school counselor is the best response, maybe working with a counselor outside might be a good way to supplement those resources. So it's really about the case and what works best for the individual, but we work with Jobs and Family Services and the school administrators to determine what's that best plan.
In my personal experience, I have worked directly with one of the Cincinnati public school social workers on a particular case involving trafficking of a child. That particular case was a labor trafficking case, it's important to work with people who have direct knowledge of the particular child's situation. In that particular case, it was very useful to have direct interaction with the school authority.
What can I do as an educator to be involved as far as in this very, very serious issue here in Cincinnati?
Report. So if you think that trafficking is occurring, it's important to connect with the appropriate professionals, similar to what was discussed in the module. However, if you do find yourself asking questions of the individual to try to get a better sense of the situation, it's important to follow those tips for interviewing a victim of child abuse and ensure that you're respecting the individual, you're not blaming the individual, you're not otherwise adding confusion to the situation, but instead engaging with the appropriate professionals who can help respond to the next steps. It might be that somebody doesn't want to share right away, and you as a school professional need to decide whether or not you're going to report based on the amount of information that you have. It's up to you and your school administrative team. But regardless of the amount of information that's shared, it may be that one day somebody feels comfortable telling you a little bit, 2 weeks later they're more comfortable giving you more specific and more detailed information. So as an educator, you could be in the social worker type of role in terms of being that support, that friendly face to that individual so they feel comfortable reporting, or you may be connecting them with other professionals along the way to help respond to the greater needs and the actual report, the law enforcement response. You can also get engaged in the coalition. The coalition is kind of the more macro response to the issue. So we have an arm that works with public education and awareness, so coordinating community education efforts throughout the greater Cincinnati area and the other counties that are served by the coalition. We also have a legislative and policy arm, which means we're advocating for local policies and procedures here. And there's other elements including victim services response. So as an educator, you may want to have a say in how you feel it's best that the social service community is responding to the needs of the victims here. You may also just want to generally engage and learn more about the issue by following us on Facebook or engaging in social media, and potentially educating your own personal network. So your church group, your book club, whatever it is, you can reach out to us, and we do provide free education and training and coordinate with other educators such as Pam on the training team to provide that type of education. So there's a lot of different ways to get involved, but sometimes just participating and sharing the knowledge with others is the best step.
Erin and Pamela, I want to thank you for taking the time out to discuss these very serious issues regarding abuse and human trafficking.
Thank you for having me.